Shabbat shalom, everyone. I wanted to take advantage of this setting this morning to actually study a little bit together. So if you haven't been to my Talking Torah class on Shabbos, this is going to give you a little taste of what the class is like. If you've never studied Torah with me, welcome to a session. Let's open up our Chumashim to page 317. Most people, when they open up the second book of the Chumash, of the Torah, the book of Exodus, focus on the motif or the theme of oppressor versus oppressed, taskmaster versus slave. I'm less interested in the dynamic of enemies or foreigners versus our family, versus our people, than I am the dynamic within our family that begins here at the second book of Exodus. Because most people simply look at Genesis and say, Genesis is a collection of our family album. Genesis is all of the family photos that we remember from our primordial Jewish stage. The pictures of Abraham and Sarah holding up Isaac. The picture of Abraham and Isaac up on Mount Moriah. The picture of Isaac and Rebekah meeting each other in front of the tent. The picture of Jacob and Esau as young men standing next to each other. When we look at it and say, these are brothers? We look at Joseph and his brothers at the pit, and then Joseph meeting his brothers once again. These are iconic photos that come up on our photo stream. And then what happens in Exodus? We're no longer a family. We're a people. Who calls us a nation or a people for the first time? Pharaoh. But Pharaoh should not be the one that controls the narrative and names us a people or a nation. I would argue that even before Ephraim and Manasseh, before any of the sibling dynamics that I would think of or want to bless my children to be like, I think the longest, most complex, healthiest sibling dynamic that we're presented with in the Torah is Moses and Aaron and Miriam. And today, Parshat Chukat, the idea that it's known for Moses' mistake is a mistake on our part in the way in which we have understood it through our tradition. If you start at the book of Exodus, instead of looking at slave and taskmaster, slave and owner, I look at as every person presented through the book of Exodus is either a savior or is vulnerable. God fits into the savior category. Moses moves from vulnerable into the savior category. Miriam is never vulnerable. We turn to page 320. Let's flip to page 320. A man of the house of Levi goes and marries a Levite woman. I'm on page 322. They bear a son. Every Jewish mother thinks that their son is going to be the great deliverer of the Jewish people. This one is the story about the mom who was right. Here we go. She raises the kid. The kid grows up. She puts it into a basket. And she puts the basket on the water because she can't bear to hide him any longer. And she can't bear to see what the Egyptian soldiers would do to him because of Pharaoh's decree. So she puts it in the water and she trusts whatever is about to happen is about to happen. And then it says, Vatitzatsev achoto. His sister stationed herself. Does the boy's sister trust? The boy's sister has enough inner strength to position herself by the river, to see with her own eyes what is about to happen, to watch over this baby as the baby enters into the dangers of the water and the dangers of Egyptian society. Pharaoh comes down to take a bath and notices the boy, and she takes pity on it. In verse 7, I'm on 323, his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh said, "Yes." And the sister immediately runs to get the boy's mother, thereby reuniting her family. There is something embedded in the DNA of Miriam that makes her unafraid, even in the presence of the great authorities of her time. Standing in front of the royals of Egypt as a slave girl, she has no fear walking up to Pharaoh's daughter and saying, "I would like to reunite my baby brother with my mother." And she convinces him to do that. She convinces her to do that. Moses doesn't say a word. We don't learn about Moses' voice for a good part of his introduction of his story, because people speak for Moses. And we think that Aaron is the one who is supposed to speak for Moses. But I can tell you, as a father with an oldest daughter and a middle boy and a youngest daughter, it's difficult for him to get a word in with his older sister around. And so if we turn to the next page, I'm on 323. Vayihim bayamim ahem, sometime after that, Moses grew up. He went out to his kinfolk and he witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He witnesses slavery for the first time in action. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. When he went out the next day, still, we have no record of him speaking a word in his life. Right? Moses' instinct is not to speak. Moses' instinct is to act. Think about how many years during slavery the Jewish people prayed with their words for somebody to come save them. And the Savior who came was somebody who lacks words, only knows how to act. He only knows how to accomplish things. He sees injustice and he solves it on the spot. He doesn't need to go ask a committee to be formed. He doesn't need to have to go ask higher authorities who's right and who's wrong. He understands from the outset what must be done, and he does it. The next morning he goes out and he sees two Hebrews fighting. And he says to one, "Why do you strike your neighbor?" This is the moment that we meet Moses' voice. Moses is trying to understand the world. Why do you strike your neighbor? He had just struck and killed someone the verse before. He understands why a person strikes another person. But why would a person strike somebody of their own people? We're not even entirely certain that he knows that he's part of this people. And yet, there's something so discordant about this moment in his mind. There's something that resonates in such a terrible way in his kishkis when he sees this, that he has to stop and say something. These are the first words that we have recorded that come out of his mouth. And they respond, "Who made you chief and ruler over us?" Right? Welcome to the Jewish people. This is his first interaction. Right? You're not the boss of me. Do you mean to kill us as you killed the Egyptian? Moses was frightened, and he thought. Now, this is why an English translation is interpretation. This is terrible. That's not what it says in the Hebrew at all. Vayar Moshe, Moses became afraid, Vayomer, and he said. It's just in English, we can't imagine who he's speaking to, so the translator makes it an inner dialogue. But this is his second speech. Achen noda hadavar. Indeed, or certainly, the matter is known. People know. People know things that Moses doesn't know. Moses becomes afraid, and what does he do? He runs away. He runs away. He does something that every single Jewish person has been praying for hundreds of years to do. Moses just turns around and walks out of Egypt. There's something in Moses, the great accomplisher, the great actor of Jewish history, that doesn't restrain him inside the boundaries of Egypt like the entire Jewish people, because perhaps it doesn't frighten him at all in the least bit. And he goes out and he acts again. The first thing he does is he shows up to a well and he sees a woman in distress and he stands up and defends her, and her father gives her to him as a wife. And Zipporah ends up becoming a voice for him, to the point where he goes to the burning bush and he meets the Savior of all saviors. He meets the Kadosh Baruch Hu, who says to him, you're the guy that's going to save the Jewish people. I'm going to send you down. And Moses says to him, Lo ish devarim anochi. I am not a man of words. I cannot speak. I cannot speak in front of people. The job that you're asking me to do is not something that I'm prepared to do. And God says, don't worry. I'll send you your brother, Aaron. He'll speak for you. Moses goes back to Egypt, and he immediately relies on the two people from whom he draws strength his entire life. Any one of us who spends time with our siblings as adults know that when our siblings gather together and we're around ourselves, it's easy to revert back to the dynamic when we were children. When siblings gather around a dinner table, right, we often even sit in the same positions as we sat when we were children, right? The jester becomes the jester, the wise child becomes the wise child, right? It's the Passover Seder of the four children all over again, each and every time. No matter how old we get, no matter how many spouses are added to the table, no matter how many children are brought to the table, siblings are always siblings. To the point where if we look over the last month or so and we say the great challenges that Moses faced, he faced the failure of the spies, he faces Korach, cousins, don't even get me started on cousins. He faces over and over again these challenges to him. But perhaps the most hurtful or the most real challenge of all is who decides to rise up and say something to him. If we turn to page 833, much closer to our Torah portion, immediately following one of the times that the Jewish people complain and say, we're starving and we should have died in Egypt and we would have been better off and blah, 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 blah. Miriam and Aaron speak up against Moses. And they accuse him of marrying again. And Midrash goes on to explain to us that they're standing up for Moses' first wife, Zipporah, that he no longer sees. And Moses takes great offense, so much so that they say to him, if you read in the text, I'm not even going to read the words, they say to him, the Lord hears it. The Lord calls to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. The three of them come out of the tent. The Lord comes down in a pillar and calls out, The two of them come forward for their punishment. Whose voice do we not hear in this whole chapter? Moses doesn't speak. Moses doesn't speak because when he's standing in front of Aaron and Miriam, he becomes the small child without words. Moses reverts back because Aaron and Miriam have always been his protectors in life. They've always been the saviors that have protected him, they've provided him what he needed. Protection on the riverbanks, a voice in front of Pharaoh, everything that he'd needed in life. He needed a high priest. Aaron was the high priest. Think about every trope we have between the siblings. They go out, and Az Yashir Moshe Uvenei Israel et Ashir Hazot. Moses and Israel sing a beautiful song upon crossing the sea. And then Miriam comes along and repeats the same song. And what does Moses do? He becomes silent, and he moves the children of Israel. When Miriam and Aaron speak, Moses becomes silent because they've always been authorities in his life. He's always listened to both of them, to the point where when God leaves them and Miriam is stricken with leprosy, both of them bring this accusation to Moses, but only Miriam gets punished. If you look at verse 10 on 834, as the cloud withdrew from the tent, there was Miriam stricken with snow-white scales. Aaron turned to Miriam. He saw she was stricken with scales. Miriam's punishment was leprosy. Aaron's punishment was to watch Miriam suffer from leprosy. Aaron says to Moses, "My Lord, account not to us the sin which we committed in our folly." I'll translate that into English. Don't blame us for the mistake we made. Don't hold it against us. Brother, speak now. You've never spoken for me and Miriam. We need you to speak on our behalf right now. So Moses cried out to God, saying, El na refa na la, the most simplest, beautiful 5-word prayer in the history of the Jewish people. Please, God, heal her now. In the speech that Moses gives, this 5 words, this monosyllabic caveman poem, El na refa na la, is the speech of a child. This is not the nuanced language of Isaiah. This is not the iambic pentameter of Shakespeare. Standing before his brother and sister, he reverts back. With all the strength in his entire being, he offers a prayer for his sister, whom I would argue he loves the most in the entire world. And we finally arrive at this parsha today. And amongst the complaints of the Jewish people, something happens between chapter 19 and chapter 20 of Numbers, and that is we don't see it in the text, but it should say to be continued because we fast forward 38 years in the desert. We skip 38 years according to the commentators, from the first year and a half to the last year of us in the desert. And the last year begins with Moses losing Miriam. Miriam passes away. Miriam passes away in the simplest of sentences. Vatamat sham Miriam vatikaber sham. She died there and she was buried there. And I want you to imagine in that sentence that the person who was writing the Torah could have gone on and written, but the author was in such grief that he put down his quill. He put down his quill and stopped writing because he began to cry. And just as he began to cry, just as he sat there for the first time in the writing of the Torah and was about to write everything that Miriam had meant to him over the course of his life. What happens in the very next story? The Jewish people barge in and they say, if we had only perished when our brothers and sisters perished at the instance of God. All of our parents have died now in the desert, the Jewish people say 38 years later. And now we don't have anything to drink. We should have died too. And so what does Moses do? He picks up his rod, he marches outside, and he says, you want water to drink? I'll give you so much water. And I admire Moses for the restraint of only beating the rock twice. Only verses earlier, he loses the strongest, most protective force in his life. He reverts back to the vulnerable child who lacks the words to express himself, and he becomes the man of accomplishment, of action, without words. He steps forward. He steps forward, and he hits the rock twice. And immediately following, his punishment is rendered, and immediately following that, his brother is taken away from him as well. This parsha ends with Moses losing everything in his family. We don't know what happened to Moses' children. We don't know what happened to Moses' wife. But we know that Moses becomes a decidedly changed person when his sister and then his brother pass away, one after the next. He loses a certain fire about him. He loses a certain determination in that last year. We'll see him ask God 2 or 3 times towards the end of the Torah to please reconsider letting him into the land of Israel. But it's certainly not the same voice that we met at the burning bush. He's changed at the age of 119, 120 years old, which is this story. This is the jump from Moses at 80, 81 to 119, 120. And I have to tell you that 120, Moses seems maybe a little bit tired. Not tired of strength, not dimmed of spirit, tired of the people and the tsuris that have walked around with him in circles for 39 years. And in the final arc of his story, after Aaron and Miriam have given him strength and protected him for so long, only after their passing, several weeks from now, will we finally meet the last act of the man with no words. Lo ish devarim becomes ish devarim. Moses, the person who says, I'm not a man of devarim, authors the final book of the Torah, his final sermon, his final instructions to us, and we call it devarim. His arc from that small, scared child to a man who could stand in front of the Jewish people and speak his mind is an arc that took 120 years and was shaped by forces beyond our comprehension, by miracles and by plagues, by pharaohs and by Jewish peasants, by water and by sand. But more than anything, it was shaped by 2 siblings who loved him more than anything in the whole world. They would never allow anything to hurt him. And in their passing, in the story of their passing, he makes a mistake. He makes a mistake because for the first time, he reverts back to being that vulnerable child. Without them at his side, he forgets himself for just the briefest of moments. And in doing so, and in becoming the author of Devarim, a man of words, I think he becomes an eternal inspiration for every Jewish leader who followed him. A promise that from even the most vulnerable child on the Nile River who lacks the strength of words to advocate for himself, one can rise up to become the strongest leader in the history of the world who advocates for justice and strength against global superpowers. Parshat Chukat begins on page 880.